Hey class, Dr. Olson. And this unit, the reading isn't as long. We've talked about caregiving and the values of the value in global health and where that is. And so let's take stock and let's talk about NGOs. So jumping right in, we talk about NGOs, we mention them a lot, and I want to, really define this. So with some key points, NGO is any nonprofit voluntary citizens group which is organized on a local, national, or international level. They're very task-oriented and driven by people with a common interest. So NGOs perform a variety of service and humanitarian functions. They bring citizen concerns to governments. They advocate and monitor for policies, and they encourage political participation through the provision of information. Some are organized around specific issues such as human rights, environment, or health. They provide analysis and expertise. And they can also serve as early warning mechanisms and help to monitor and implement international agreements. The relationship with the offices and agencies of the United Nations system differs depending on their goals, their venue, and the mandate of the particular institution. But as you see in this chapter, they're very, very central to global health. So just looking back, by 1854, I think there were only like 6, right, NGOs. One of the earliest ones was the Anti-Slavery International from 1839, which started transnational civic campaigns and created the abolition as this pressing political issue in the United States. Really helped drive that social change, galvanize the citizenship, right, in uniting on a cause, on a purpose, and bringing people together to create that political change. On United Order of the Templars, International Workingmen's Association, etc., the International Alliance of Women, right at the start of the 20th century. And of course, this is a big one for us in global health. 1863, the predecessor to the International Red Cross, and it was started by Henry Dunant. He was Swiss, and he had witnessed the Battle of Solferino, and he saw 40,000 soldiers killed in a single day. And he said, look, there's no medical care available. What a terrible, tragic, loss of life. He wrote a book on it and about this battle and stuff. And he got together with some other families in Geneva, and together they worked to form this International Committee of the Red Cross. And it's really significant that it was the International Committee. Why? Because, what they're really looking to do is to say it doesn't matter if this is, in particular, they're interested in helping at war. So it's like, it doesn't matter what country you're from. This health is this universal thing, and we don't care which country, it's going to be international. And so really interesting and important information about the history of the Red Cross and how it was founded. But then let's think about institutional frameworks in the U.S. John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. He said he advocated for the founding of the USAID, United States the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And this, what he created, the justification. So think of the time period, right? Think of what's going on in the 60s, and he said, look, the U.S. This is the foreign policy tactic. We're going to go to other countries, but we're going to bring aid. We're going to bring resources and nutritional support and food supplements and medicines. We're not, and with it, of course, goes the ideology. Well, we're also going to, insist that they have free market, open economies, and insist that, help them find democratic processes in their government and etc. So, right, and some people. Some academics, some people are, because of that early days and that founding and the role that USAID plays, are a little bit skeptical sometimes, because it is an arm of the government. It does have a political motivation, right? So for example, like if you're, say you're working in Malawi with an NGO and you're getting money from USAID, well, that funding, what are the terms that it comes with? And then your NGO's presence in Malawi, what impact and what message does it send? And I'm just, so that we see this from all sides. And I think, of course, you could say, well, if we're in Malawi, they're going to recognize, right, that we're we're representing the U.S. That's one of the things with when you travel. Um, you notice, you realize, and people will ask you, where are you from? They want to know, which country are you from? Because everything that you do, even if you're just traveling, but especially if you're working on a project, like as an NGO, everything you do represents the country that you're from. And people, right, for better or for worse, I mean, people are making all kinds of judgments and assumptions and things and coming to conclusions. So anyways, Ronald Reagan expands on this notion, and in the 1980s, he said the U.S. needs to be doing more. We need to be doing more internationally. And he said, well, we have the Democracy Program Report, and he said we need to use NGOs as a transplanting mechanism that can help synchronize foreign policy with political aid. Boom. And he said, we need to create the National Endowment for Democracy, where we promote open market economy as a prerequisite for the democratic political process. So he really saw these two as linked in terms of bringing in open markets, opening up economies, and bringing democracy at the same time. So why NGOs? So if we have USAID, we have, things like that. We have the UN. Why NGOs? And, I don't know if you can see, I put it in this blue here, right? The call out the key terms here. NGOs are really sort of seen as these intermediaries, as like an alternative to the government. And because they operate in this sort of gray area, they're not for profit, right? But they can work towards political goals. They can work with public goals. They also can work in like private sector sort of things, like healthcare and stuff like that, which is private sector in some countries. And so it's this idea that we have a third sector out there, right? That's neither private sector nor civil society, is in between. And because they're private, right? They're seen as more efficient, and because they can just say, well, we're gonna NGOs very rarely, they do pay board of directors some and things like that, but not very much. The very minimal wages for officers of NGOs. They're not for profit, so that's part of the guidelines, is that they need to be operated as such, and they're usually because they're very objective and task oriented, they're very efficient with money. You don't lose a lot of money in like, wow, we pay, a bunch of people. They don't have like extra offices and extra office. Everybody who is in the NGO is vital to the operation and is driving it forward. Donors channel money through NGOs for that reason. So for USAID, for example, it's mandated. That money goes through NGOs. Why not directly to other government? Why not directly to, the Malawi example, right? Why not just directly to the Malawian government? Well, that's different, right? I mean, and so keep that in mind, that we're funneling it through NGOs for a reason, and with that money, of course, come terms, stipulations as to how USAID will fund, what types of projects it will fund, what are the guidelines for the usage, and NGOs have to report back to USAID that results in things like that. So it leads to a greater, in terms of the USAIDs, for example, you have more accountability from the NGO in terms of what they did, and more oversight. And there's, the problem with corruption, and if you already have, it's a faltering or maybe a shaky political situation, that's why they want to funnel it through NGOs very often, is because of that instability and that the ability to have, we maintain a lot more oversight if it's through an NGO. But they are seen as vehicles of democratization, a counterweight to the state. So, and in the absence of the state, the NGOs can fill that political vacuum, right? Temporarily, be sort of this intermediary. What are the advantages, right? What are the advantages of NGOs? They're innovative. They can do things, they can do cutting edge things. You've got people who are focused on a problem, they're passionate about it. they're going to be bringing, well, we can desalinate this water using this technique and blah, 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 to help people get fresh water or whatever, right? They're going to be right at the edge of that. And that's how they become, they're really funding agencies. They become, NGOs do a really good job of getting donations and fundraising. They're also more effective in in delivery of services. You don't lose as much through the gaps and through intermediaries. They're able to go in and, I mean, they can say, okay, we're going to implement this program directly for the communities most in need, the part of the population that's most in need, the most vulnerable, the poorest of the poor. And I think you can imagine very easily other situations in which, like a struggling government or something like that, or just any government, they have to attend to a broader set of draws on terms of what they're able to fund and things like that. A government just can't say, well, I'm just going to focus on the poorest of the poor, but an NGO can do that. They are in a better place to develop community-based institutions and promote popular participation too. So NGOs have grown. Look at this. Yeah, 1854, we had 6 NGOs. Up to 176, 50 years later. Give it, and give it 28,900. And then up to 60,000 by 2007. There's more today. So between 1975 and 1985, in 10 years, there was a 1,400% increase in NGO funding. Between 1980 and 1993, in 13 years, funding doubled to $5.7 billion. And in 1993, half of all World Bank projects included an NGO component. So NGOs provide health, education, agricultural assistance, credit services, microloans, stuff like that, anything. NGOs are there. Wow. And so, there's pros and cons to anything, of course. NGOs, they're dependent on donor money. Usually it's international, it's from abroad, and it's tied to policies of the donor states. So you get this, I alluded to this earlier in the USAID example, but what you get is a patron-client relationship. So meaning they have to, the donor has a lot of say in what they'll say, well, I want you to, do this, but I want you to work on women's health, but I don't want you to, maybe they'll put limitations or restrictions on what types of family planning methods they'll allow the aid money to be used for example. There's a lack of accountability sometimes to local populations and either the country of origin or the site of work, meaning on both ends. There can be, if the NGO gets so wrapped up with the donor money and doing what they're doing, they maybe lose touch of both sides of that. The country of origin, meaning where they came from, that accountability, and the accountability to the local population where they're serving. This is question that does donor-led development, lead to governmentality, right? What does that mean? That a lot of this is all about building institutions and governance. So is it democratization? It depends on how you think of democracy. If you think of democracy, as most of us tend to, like if I said, here in class, you're all going to get together and you're going to do this democratically, usually what you would just kind of as a knee-jerk go to is you'd say, okay, well, each of us is going to have one vote. And we're going to, come up with options. We're going to collectively brainstorm things. And that's a really bottom-up sort of, right? If that's how you think of democracy, which is correct, it's a, one person, one vote situation. But that's not exactly how it works then if we're talking about NGOs bringing in donor money from a more powerful country, from a wealthy donor country, and that donor, right, gets to put rules on how the money is spent, how the funding is used, how the program is delivered. And yes, they use an intermediary, the NGO, but that's really top down. And so there's a lot of criticism about what that idea of participation really means. Is it more just paying lip service to the idea of community-based, participatory, etc.? And for some of the types of programs, is it so much as like, well, these, 100 people in this community participated. What does that mean? That they received the payment, that they accepted the, the care package, the food supplements or something, so that counts as they participated. We just, when I say a word like participate, you're thinking like, no, like they got involved, they maybe had some ideas about it, they talked to somebody, they learned something, or they engaged, or, but maybe, how do we feel about it if we're using the term like participation and it really just means received? So, also, yeah, NGOs can be really innovative, but sometimes they can just recycle like, hey, we did this project over there, now I want you to do it here, right? Or like, hey, this certain donors will say like, I really like these types of projects, so I want to just keep doing them. and again, this is hard. As an anthropologist myself, who does a lot of community-based participatory research, it's tough sometimes to see that and think, well, that's not really you. What if we went in and asked this community and learned about this community, involved them in the process from the bottom up, right, from the grassroots? So it's not to say that we don't get innovation from NGOs and that they don't help support democracy. It's just things to be aware of, things to keep in mind. Are they really cost effective? Well, we assume they are because, but it really depends on how you measure it and how we do the accounting and what we're looking at. So, cost effectiveness, how do we calculate it? What do you look at? What are the outcomes? What are the variables, right? Do you look at it as, not more, more preventable deaths or not, right? Like, so the metrics, we talked about that previously in another unit, the metrics matter. And another thing to be cautious or just be mindful of is, do they always reach the poor? No. No, sometimes the most vulnerable are the most marginalized, and they're the most vulnerable, and even the best intentioned, you're not, well, it's going to take a lot more effort and repeated effort. So anyway, so it's not always so simple. So we've got a lot to think about, and I think I want to end this lecture on this note. I want to end on the idea of the 8 principles that we get from the accompaniment approach, because it's like, so what do we do, right? How do we do this? And I think the first thing that we do, so this is from Farmer and them. You favor institutions that the poor identify as representing their interests. Start with listening and determining which institutions the beneficiaries believe are working in their interests. The ones who will receive the help often know what has worked in the past and what has not. 2, fund public institutions to do their job. Fund the government so that they are able to still function. If the donors are very concerned with corruption or a lack of capacity of the local government, then it can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy in which they will not have enough money to be functional and not end up being good, right? The best way to build capacity and combat corruption is to support the development of systems of accountability and transparency, practicing the accompaniment. That's the principle of that. All right, so okay. Some of this is hard to hear, but this is really good recommendations from the Partners in Health team who have so much experience on the ground doing this. Number 3, make job creation a benchmark of the success. Local job creation and transfer of capacity to local partners is so essential to true development, right? It helps people achieve autonomy and basic well-being. It gives them dignity, self-worth, and opportunities to pursue professional development. Job creation can also stimulate local economies and strengthen the national tax base. So these are 2 cornerstones of a robust public health sector and a health system and a strong, solid government and country. Related to that, number 4, buy and hire locally. This will help stimulate local development. Buying foreign products can weaken local economies by importing goods and services at even lower prices. So buying and hiring locally allows for creation of jobs, development of local markets, boosting of tax revenues, and stimulation of entrepreneurship. Number 5, we're halfway, co-invest with governments to build strong civil services. So workforce development in the public sector proceeds best with platforms of transparent hiring and firing, including performance reviews, continuing training programs for civil servants, and the ability to assess workforce needs. Create a robust training programs that can build in capacity into the government and into the society. Number 6, work with governments to provide cash to the poorest. This can really help to reduce poverty. It can, the poorest of the poor. It can boost demand for goods and services, right? Create consumers and thus stimulate the local economies. And if it's associated with health programs, it can be effective at increasing health in certain populations and what the risk, depending on what the risk factors. Sometimes it's like you have people who really don't have money for food and basic needs. So of course they're going to keep getting sick, right? Number 7, support the regulation of international non-state service providers. So sometimes this is hard to hear, but it's the truth. There needs to be some sort of communication between the different help agencies. Harmonizing foreign aid efforts increases the likelihood of them helping to generate meaningful, lasting change for the intended beneficiaries. Instead of just having, 100 NGOs, each running independently, kind of running towards the same problems, but not coordinating. Number 8, supply evidence-based standards of care that offer the best outcomes. Accompaniment program is based on equity. That's the premise of it. And that means that demands raising the standard of care in resource-poor settings to a level that would be acceptable in wealthier countries. I think these 8 principles, they're really, they set the bar high, but of course that's where we need to aim, right? Pretty inspiring, big challenges, but so we'll leave it at that for this unit.